Welcome back, guys, to the ultimate collaboration on our magnum opus with the bi-weekly Bean and Big Bobby Blogs. All right, today I wanted to talk to a special guest, despite myself also being a special guest.
Yeah,
Um,
we're
to,
guests to each other.
we are just guests to each other, and I would like to talk to uh, Beans of the bi-weekly Bean. So how are you, Beans? Are you ready to discuss the significance of this topic?
Yeah, yep. I sure love the part where I know exactly what the topic is. So, Big Bobby, can you please enlighten the general audience as to what exactly our topic is?
Yeah, of course. So, if we take a look at our amazing website, actually, we wanted to go into, at least in our collaboration, on the different ways that prejudice is felt on a daily basis through culture and through bias that is a result of a lack of knowledge on culture. So, if you'd like to get us started, we could always talk about, have you or have any other family members, noticed this sort of overall trend as to, you know, this sort of cultural disconnect between people?
Yeah, for sure. I just want to make sure everyone that's currently listening to this knows that this is a very important issue, which is what the point of this video is, to prove that what our entire massive blog post is actually important. So as to
Right,
my
right.
yeah, as to my personal interactions with prejudice, um, my parents are Cuban. I was technically also born there, but like I was like 3, so it doesn't really count. So there's a thing that my parents always told me when I was little about like how Cubans like they'd hate the Yankees, referring to like the Americans and their capitalist culture and how like selfish
Right.
and brutal they were, and why you should never want to go there, even if you're currently starving to death and your children are dying in your arms. As like you take this several-hour journey to the closest hospital that may or may not even have the equipment to save your kid's life, you still don't want to go to America, which
Right.
is like the infinitely better alternative because you've been told all your life that these people are like malicious, evil, selfish, greedy pigs, the capitalist pig thing. And there's just that
Mhm.
severe prejudice.
Yeah, yeah, I could understand that. This sort of context is also felt in my own family as well. I understand what you're saying about that, and I do think they, need to enlighten themselves on what, while this is a rather debilitating healthcare, I still think that it's, at least better than what could be provided over there too. And we could also educate ourselves on, that sort of culture and that sort of healthcare as well. We have many people within China as well, which is where my mom is from, and there the prejudice towards Americans, or Yankees, as your area called it, is also very is felt very strongly. We have many different sorts of like opinions on it, but they're all rather felt, in the same way, in which either like Americans are not smart enough, or that their education system is not good enough. But at the same time, they sort of contradict themselves by sending their children here, either way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, because they start realizing, hey, the economy here is good, but while nothing else here is good, I'm just going to send my child here to, learn and get rich and benefit the family, while at the
Yeah.
same time I continue to shame, their values.
I think that's like a really common theme with like international like discrimination like that, especially like towards America. Well,
Hmm.
they're like, oh, this country's way worse than us, but they're so rich, might as well send my kids there. And even if they don't think that, they'll still
Hmm.
send their kids just because like the idea of like this is like a really old idea if you've like taken a push and stuff like that. That America for a long time was like this beacon of opportunity and prosperity where you could just go there and you could become rich and you could send back to your family and everybody related to you could thrive. America still kind of has that status, even when arguably some of the
Hmm.
opportunities have dwindled. I think that's like really
Hmm.
interesting about America. Also, I wanted to
Right.
mention the role of like government in these two specific instances of prejudice. Like usually when you talk about prejudice, you think it's like between people, you think it's like the culture, but sometimes it's like
Hmm.
government enforced specifically. Like my example, which I know best, is like Cuba. The government tells you, oh, these people are bad, these people are capitalists. Our country is the best. You shouldn't go over there because they want to limit any immigration because they know that if they let that happen, they'd have like they already do have like massive brain bleed, if you know what that is, where like the smartest people in an area or like a country will leave towards more proper prosperous ones because they are better like able to be better developed or like better rewarded for their abilities. So sometimes the government purposefully pushes against that and gives and tells their people on purpose, like with almost malicious intent, that these other people are bad, you shouldn't go there.
Hmm. Yeah, and as for my area as well, we have lots of different impacts that are felt in which at least the government itself tends to impose itself on its people by I would say it comes through the recent coronavirus as well. For the past couple of years,
Mm,
there has been lots of stigmatism building there, in which the government itself is spreading influence on its people, saying that, oh, the coronavirus, look at America and look at how America is dealing with this. But because of this, this is where they start to believe they must, radically change their views. And then, in order to deal with this virus, they must continue to shut all the Chinese people in just
mm,
because they wouldn't want to deal with it in the same way that the United States is dealing with it. And then you have the United States who believes that, China has a bunch of cowardly people, and why are they staying inside? Why are they wearing masks? Why should I be wearing a mask when I am trying to enforce my freedom and filled values? And even though it's more sensible to do so, this is also a product of the executive government, I should say, on the American people as well. We have been promoting a lot of nationalism in the past century as well, especially throughout the Cold War. Before that, there has been a lot of competition between the United States and Russia. And in order to fuel that drive to complete the war, to complete the Vietnamese War, the Korean War, to spread, democracy over communism, and to at least like eradicate the globe of this of this
mm.
communism. A lot of nationalism is spread throughout the United States, and but in that comes a lack of knowledge for Russian forces, or Russian sentiments, or any other country's sentiments. Many soldiers, when they pick up the Vietnamese RAC, or I believe it's called the RCA. Not sure what it is, but it's essentially,
Mm.
exposing why exactly, the Vietnamese are here and why they're attacking Vietnam. And they are people just like them, and they are experiencing the same things just like them. But this sort of, prejudice is held against both sides, and it seems as if both sides never truly know each other in that sense.
Yeah, I think like when you mentioned nationalism, I think that's like a really important point. How
Hmm.
prejudice usually like feeds into nationalism a lot. But I think you said nationalism is like historically, at least in the United States, like a very powerful force. It was like almost like the status quo. But I think that
Right.
newer generations have strayed away from that. Like if you ever gone on Twitter, like this is a very contemporary example. If you've ever been on Twitter, you know a lot of people like to complain about America and the state of affairs and things like that.
Hmm.
And nationalism has taken a new tone as like something that's like incredibly selfish and uneducated. But I would like to make the argument that some semblance of nationalism is required for the continuance of a country. For
Hmm.
example, like the United States, we have our own interests. Like any person, let's say you turn a country into a person, that person needs to have some sense of self-preservation to continue existing. If you
Hmm.
always sacrifice yourself for other people, you won't be able to continue living your life. You'll always be in some form of suffering. So it's important to have some amount of nationalism, but like more educated nationalism to make sure that a nation still is cohesive as a whole. but of course not to the extent of historically with like Vietnam and all that jazz did not go very well.
Yeah, and I can totally agree with that. You notice that nationalism in itself is a guiding force to keep a nation together. This is a centripetal force. I'm pulling out the AP human geography words, but
Yeah.
in order to keep a nation together and not pull it apart, especially as a new nation, you must have to be able to promote a little bit of nationalism and have people feel a little bit of pride for staying in this country
Mm.
so that it doesn't easily tear apart when conflict happens, correct? So, but as you mentioned, there is nationalism felt in extreme contexts, and not just Vietnam, but the even more extreme situation in which we have Germany and we have Hitler, correct?
Hmm.
This is a very big phenomenon in which nationalism was promoted to an extent which has almost brainwashed, the minds of the people to, it definitely kept the state itself together, but it was to a point where information was on, I usually call it a third logic basis, because this information, while it is rather strong pieces of information, are being censored and being given to the public in a way that is not completely informing them of what other nations are doing, what other nations are feeling, and just simply focusing on the state's agenda and pushing that agenda and ensuring that they're feeling strongly about their country and they're not going to question the motives of their country. So just once again, that inability to really consider other countries and their stance and their viewpoint on things, and simply feeling that blind loyalty to one's country to not have to question anything, is definitely, it's very powerful and it's very dangerous.
I think that you brought up like Nazis, which is, is I
Oh
think
yeah, I sure did. I sure did.
I think they have a special sort of nationalism. I don't think it's your traditional sort of nationalism, which is like
Mhm.
us, our country against these evil forces. I think they have a sort of very like
Right.
self-destructive nationalism, because it's not just the state
Absolutely.
versus the world, it's also the people within the state. Like if you take the Jews for examples, I think they killed the Jewish people, disabled gays, anybody like that. And even though they were defeated in the war, so they wouldn't last, if they continued on the path they were going, they would eventually crumble apart because it would the nationalistic force, which is usually supposed to be like centripetal, like to hold people together, like to stop a country from falling apart, would eventually
Mhm.
torn people apart because of there's like an I'm not really quite sure how to explain, but us versus them within the country. So there's different subgroups that eventually become undesirable. So if you have any amount of Jewish in you, suddenly you become the bad. You're part of the evil group. Or if you have any amount of like,
The
if your like uncle was gay, like uncle thrice removed, and suddenly you're also undesirable. And over time, people would start ripping into each other to see who is the purest blood, who deserves to be this like perfect air part of the perfect Aryan race who
uh-huh.
doesn't have any flaws.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I was actually going to mention earlier that it was self-destructive because when you see it, it's definitely like a very special kind of nationalism, and this kind of nationalism, it's very diluted, but at the same time, it definitely gives you insight. I would definitely say to a more extreme range that's not just like, oh, I love my country and I feel the need to protect my country and stand behind, my family, and stand in front of, my brothers and sisters in arms, but rather, sometimes like while nationalism has the point where it's like I will want to die for my country, that definitely has its extremes and it's a very strongly felt nationalism, though I should definitely say that nationalism within Nazi Germany was also more of like a you must feel this way kind of basis.
Hmm.
So I think at that point, definitely it might not be nationalism in the way that it's hypocritical, you have people on one end that definitely feel a certain way, but when this agenda is pushed too far, they are strongly felt, but it is in the context where I must fight or I will die, I have to die for my country,
Mm.
or else I simply won't live. You have soldiers, I believe on drugs, correct?
Mm.
This was yeah, these were soldiers on steroids, running out to go sacrifice themselves for their country because they will no longer live anyhow. But these are simply just extreme contexts in which this is felt, and almost just completely strays away from that sort of understanding of us versus them, because at that point you're not necessarily human anymore. But
Mm.
um yeah, definitely. I wanted to talk about a more modern circumstance, though. And I think you had some insight, perhaps, on conflict at around like that age in America, 2001 for 9/11.
Yeah. Yes. Real.
I just guessing that that you
Yeah.
have this information at
Oh
hand,
yeah. Just
right? So.
I mean, I think it's a pretty big event. I think most people would know about it, but yeah, I think we should probably like dial it back a tiny bit. So we're gonna get into something a little bit more topical, which would be like 9/11, about like specifically prejudice. We talked about some in like how it can tighten international tensions with like wars and like Vietnam and all that, but it can also tighten internal conflict as well, like we mentioned with Nazi Germany, but more specifically with 9/11. It would be I've heard a lot of anecdotal stories about people, specifically Arabs and Muslims, especially those that practiced it and were like obvious and like visible, which is especially what prejudice thrives in, when someone is visibly, and you can tell just at a glance exactly who they are, what like denomination they fall into, exactly like what
Mhm.
subgroup you can put them in that little box in. That's where it thrives best. People would look at their neighbors, like who they've lived with for like 12 years or so, and they'll look at them with sharp eyes, like as they're a new threat, as if they were the very terrorists that crashed into the building. And it really wasn't good for the few, they were a minority at the time, and they still are. But it really wasn't good for the people just living in the country trying to have their life always looked at as if there was some monster or something that had to do nothing to do with who they actually were or anybody they subscribed to or followed.
Yeah, right. I definitely agree in which in that internal area you can definitely see that people who have never had their lives affected by this, and even though they were a minority group, they are not as regarded heavily as they are now in America. In America you
Mm-hmm.
see that there are people at least regarding these people, and you can see and you can feel hate that is being targeted towards these people for who they are. And they had absolutely no actions oriented towards this thing. But even today, so many years later, there is still that hate towards that one thing that happened many years ago, towards people that are not involved as well too.
Mm-hmm.
They are living in America and not part of Al Qaeda, not part of the Taliban, but still in the same way they like to generalize this. Outside of this internal conflict, we have the external conflicts that lie in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and we notice these very ideologically fractured Taliban, in which their views towards Americans are definitely different, and they don't have the same religious views, they don't have the same ideological views. We have women in particular there have to bear the brunt of the new Taliban rule.
Mm-hmm.
And human rights organizations have been reporting that women there have had to give up their jobs in many areas. And some Afghan women have fled to Pakistan because they're, they fear, being forced to marry these Taliban fighters, and they grant women very few rights for them.
Mm-hmm.
For them, women belong in a very dungeon-like environment, and namely the four walls of their own home. There, they have to perform certain tasks, bear children, run the household, and be ready for their husband's sexual desire at any time. this view of women is neither, religiously legitimate, nor Islamically justifiable. However, and this view is viewed from us as not necessarily something that is good, but at the same time we are now educated on what their view is, and I, because I am educated on this view, I can make my opinions on this. But other people who do not necessarily know about this tend to generalize it, towards Muslims here, and people over there who do not know about Americans here tend to generalize us as either, being too free spirited, perhaps we think too much about freedom, perhaps we are, well, in that way, just quote unquote too free in a sense. And we grant, too many rights to women per se, and but in this way, because of our different beliefs, they tend to pick apart, a singular one, and then begin to view us as, in short, bad. So, and just as, we look at, the American people may tend to look at Muslims and generalize, that local word terrorist, right? So,
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know like too much about the actual religion, so I'll probably hold off on commenting that. I think it's really important at this point that since we've been recording for over 20 minutes, we I think it's important that we start tying in some of the stuff we've said already into specifically like the book's examples of it. I think like earlier
mhm,
you mentioned something really interesting with like Paris syndrome, specifically like
yeah.
we both read the book Osako,
Mhm.
and I think you made a really interesting comment about what he would do if he went to Paris. Um,
Oh, yes, yes, yes. I thought, if he went to Paris, I think he'd kill himself, honestly.
yeah.
I think I think Osaka would kill himself. I mean, like, honestly, yeah, yeah. Did you have anything else to say, or did you want me to go on about this
Yeah.
Paris syndrome?
You can continue about that, but I was just gonna say, like, honestly, I think he does have pretty impressive mental fortitude because even after being like confronted with him being like factually incorrect with like Gaston
Right.
right in front of his face, like of actual genuine like Frenchman, like touchable, he
Uh-huh.
was still like, nah, Paris is cool. You just don't count, as he was like non-existent. If he's just like some glitch that came out of the Matrix, like doesn't count. Paris is still my perfect idealized mental like figment or whatnot.
Right, right. So you could say that in this way, perhaps if we notice someone, let's say, an immigrant from somewhere, and we don't see them as fitting of the mental picture that we have of ourselves, perhaps, because that evidence is not enough to show what this country is about, he might, continue having, his nice little mental delusion that Paris is all beautiful and all wonderful. Do you think?
Do I think?
Yeah.
Occasionally. Um,
Well,
like in
I mean,
general.
going in general, do you think that because we might as well view we don't view countries differently when seeing like immigrants perhaps because they're just like that single like, oh, glitch in the matrix, he's probably not, he just isn't a representative of my ideal image, so it's
Hmm.
okay if he doesn't count, do you think
Yeah.
that's possible?
I
And
think,
okay.
yeah, I think probably like he's like, oh, he came out of like some backwater like valley, like under a hill, like under some like greasy bridge or something, like some sort of troll, like haunting his perfect fairy tale land above. So I feel like if he was met
Uh-huh.
with like a very large crowd, like if he was there in Paris, I think he'd probably like, go into some sort of shock because it's so many people and so much in front of his eyes that he can't easily like dismiss it the same way he can dismiss one individual. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And for those of you who don't know what Paris syndrome is, bi-weekly Bean and Big Bobby blogs have decided to go into this a little bit more and research into this, and it turns out that Paris syndrome has its own, Japanese word for it. I'm not going to pronounce it because it'll be terrible,
It's
but
okay.
uh, it is a it's gonna be like a
Go ahead.
party Shoko gun.
Mm,
Yes. Yes.
try. Just try it, even if you say it like it's an English word.
All right. Well, this Paris syndrome, anyhow, is a sense of extreme disappointment exhibited by some individuals when visiting Paris, who feel that the city was not what they had expected. This condition is commonly viewed as a severe form of culture shock. So typically, what happens is that when these individuals go to Paris, they literally experience acute delusions, hallucinations, and other sorts of different symptoms that are somehow like just this very severe, form of like culture shock in
Mm-hmm.
which they're realizing this isn't these aren't the little jolly metro cars and antique underground stations
Mm-hmm.
that we see in films. They're just hot, overcrowded carriages filled with groping couples, screaming children, and loud accordion music.
Mm-hmm.
And this doesn't stop Paris from being a nice city. Every city has its own pros and cons. But it's because that media is wiping these downsides, which is why these people are getting this wonderful view of this place and realizing, oh goodness, there I have to view the gritty underbelly of the public image. And so this disparity between what we see and what we get starts to hit tourists, and it apparently hits some of them, especially Japanese people, pretty
Mm-hmm.
hard. um, so the common symptoms are like acute delusions, hallucinations, dizziness, sweating, and feelings of persecution. So this just starts to wrap them into this psychological spin, and it has caused several cases. And this has also caused the patient to be flown back to their original country under medical supervision. Usually, bed rest and hydration seem to take care of this problem within a few days. But the Japanese embassy has had a lot of people recently who call or visit to be reassured that this beautiful city that is now a nightmare is not going to collapse right in front of them. So quite interesting.
Yeah, I think like the biggest issue, like you said, is like the juxtaposition between like the sky high expectations and then what they actually see. Like if they were set for a reasonable understanding, like if I were to go to Paris, I think I have like an okay idea of what it's like. I understand there's like
Hmm.
a bunch of shady things going on, like in any major city, especially with so much tourism. There's
Right.
definitely gonna be people trying to scam you. But I feel like if you have reasonable expectations, you're
Hmm.
better able to actually enjoy what you're looking at. You're able to see the good past like the absolute like shock of seeing so much bad in front of you. Um, I also want to mention exactly why Paris is the thing in question, like why it's this city specifically. At least I don't know too much about other
Hmm.
people, but I think I know a little bit about like specifically Japan, because in
Hmm.
at least the time frame the book was written, like post World War II, like Reconstruction, almost trying to get back their image, they tried to
Hmm.
modernize with the image of France as their like goal, their beacon. It was their like gold standard for sophistication, artistry, all of this like amazing development. And this
Hmm.
percolated down into the people, the citizens themselves, and they started viewing France as this like perfect like area, like the Renaissance basically, if it were real, and like a real place. Yeah, if the Renaissance were real, imagine. Um, yeah, they start viewing it as this like perfect like beacon of purity, sophistication. Everyone there speaks 50 languages, can do like 5,000 IQ math. All of the everyone
Hmm.
sits in like little cafes, like sipping black coffee with pinkies out or whatnot. Yeah.
Right, right. Uh-huh. Yeah, I can understand that. And definitely, I find it interesting that they tend to romanticize that culture a lot. Whereas as for Japanese culture itself, we do see a large population of both European and American
Mm-hmm.
people
Yeah.
that tend to like to romanticize Japanese culture, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we want
Mm-hmm.
to talk about weaves. Let's talk
Yeah.
about weaves. Yeah, I'm not too much of a big anime watcher. I've watched like a
Mm-hmm.
singular anime this year, but I'm a convenience watcher. I watch what's
Yeah.
like 10 episodes long. But
Hmm.
usually when you do see people, especially as someone who is not really in the community that much, seeing people that really like it a lot is definitely a shock for me as well to watch because, this can get to an extreme where and while there are like very healthy extremes like cosplaying, going to these conventions to enjoy this aspect, there are people who go into a more extreme form of this weebism or weebing out. So, do you think you can go into any of your personal experiences with that, or do you not have any?
No, I do have some. As someone who
Oh,
has,
you do.
yeah, as someone who has consumed an absurd quantity of media from the general like Asian area, um,
Right.
like webtoons, anime, manga, all that jazz, like
Mhm.
hours, worthless hours. Anyway, like, have you ever heard of a mall ninja?
Mall Ninja, I think so. They just run like the anime ninjas,
Like the
right? Like
Naruto. The
yeah,
idea,
they Naruto run.
the idea is like some otaku basically. If you don't know what that is, it's like some Japanese term that people started using for some reason, which means someone that's like
Hmm.
obsessed with their own hobbies and like never leaves home. It has like a bunch of negative connotations. And most people in America use it to mean someone who's like really into anime, like thousands of dollars into buying figurines worth of anime. Um,
Hmm.
And generally, it's considered like the mall ninjas are cringe. Like they buy a bunch of like super fantasy stuff that looks really tacky, but it like fits their aesthetic.
Hmm.
And I think this phenomenon, like extreme weeaboo-ness, through like the Western world, is because of the advent, I think, of internet made it like anime really, really popular, and helped it spread to like the
Right.
youth because like bright,
Hmm.
colorful, energetic, all this action. So it really appeals to these people, and with social media, it spreads really, really quickly. And it's a lot easier to dodge information about like actual Japan than it is to dodge anime. So some people get really
Hmm.
deep into these animes, these shows. They'll see like Naruto and like ancient Japan with like shoguns and all this jazz. And they'll be really, really into it, and they'll get like these ideas in their head. And then when they see actual Japan, they might only see pictures of it, like online. They might see Tokyo with like, what's it called, the cherry blossoms falling, and like the school and the schoolgirl outfits. This is slightly, actually, I should probably not say it.
Right.
Actually, now I'm gonna say it anyway. So there's like a big boom in like the fetish of anime girl like costumes, like schoolgirl costumes, just because they've been in so much
Hmm.
anime, and that translates into its NSFW counterpart. There's a lot of weebs out there,
Hmm.
man. I think most people, like most anime enjoyers, aren't weebs. Because most people are obviously like in the middle of the bell curve, but when you get to those edges, it gets like really scary, man.
Hmm. Yeah, and I do know that at least for those people who have consumed like you said, you can probably dodge a lot of information about Japan, but you probably can't dodge a lot of information about, Japanese animation and stuff. And so
Hmm.
once you start getting into it, when these people go to Japan, I'm sure they're probably like, "Oh, I have to get food in a convenience store in Japan.
Yeah.
I didn't know
I hope I
they
get run over
look
by a
like this."
truck, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then I did not know that like, the food that they were eating was just like regular fast food, I thought
Hmm.
this was like some sort of delicacy, or like, I want to eat ramen, but like you realize
Ooh,
that
yeah.
like while ramen is a thing, it's it's also a fast food in this like, Japanese area. You don't really see people eating ramen too much, in
Hmm.
Japan, And all these different attractions are just like all these like different little anime attractions are well are all just like small parts of the bigger picture that is like actually Japan, and people live a normal life just like us, and people are not anime as some people might think. There are not going to be like a billion sakura trees blooming,
Sakura,
and
yeah.
there's not going to be bamboo everywhere you run,
Hmm.
and there's going to be nobody certainly running with toast in their mouth, so
Yeah. I I want to mention specifically, you remind me of something pretty important, which is the unrealistic expectations, like the idealization of Japanese women. Specifically, like if you've ever watched an
Mhm.
anime, specifically like an ecchi or ones that's like aimed towards like young boys or older boys who are frustrated. Um, you
Right.
see very peculiar behavior of the women, and they'll go to Japan expecting women to be like this. They'll expect them like, yeah, trip over and like toast in their mouth or whatever, or at least be really into them, and be like these perfect, or these
Mhm.
like perfect modest icons, like a perfect teacher is like super intelligent all the time, but they aren't necessarily, and they'll come to Japan, they'll expect these like beautiful women that are just gonna be throwing themselves all over them because you've seen the average
Mhm.
protagonist, because a lot of Japanese media is made in with the average person in mind. So if you've ever seen a
Mhm.
protagonist for like an ecchi, they're overwhelmingly average, and that's very much on purpose to be able to be like a self-insert onto that.
Mhm.
So you can feel like you're the one getting all the attention, showered with this entirely undeserved love, when in reality, if you actually went to
Mhm.
Japan, you wouldn't see that at all.
Right. Mhm. Yeah, so it's definitely a good, healthy reminder that though this country is producing content that may be very iffy and it shouldn't be something that you should start applying to their own culture and then believing that if you were to go there, that you would have to be greeted with this same representation that they give you in their media.
Hmm.
So yeah, just a good thing to look out for as well, and
Hmm.
hopefully we'll be able to solve that crisis within this weeb community. But it's all right, yeah. And it was a nice talking to you.
Yeah, I
So,
think uh, if you can stay here for like just one more minute, I think I want to wrap up like in a few sentences exactly what we talked about. Like I think we talked
of
about the
course.
role of prejudice in societies, specifically relating to
Mm-hmm.
government a few times, and how it can be both like a pull and push force,
Mm-hmm.
and how in Prejudice there's both unrealistically high and unrealistically low expectations. Like you see someone and you think they're a terrorist versus you see someone and you think they must be a math genius because they have slightly like narrower eyes, you know? Is there anything else that
Right.
I missed in my summary?
Not necessarily. It's just more so, understanding these different extremes in which syndromes can actually appear because of, people's
Mm-hmm.
like unrealistic expectations of society dawned upon them. Wanted to at least brush over the fact that media is also a big influence
Mm-hmm.
in our understanding of different cultures. They either generalize it too much or they focus on specific details that have that our own brains try to generalize because we have such limited information. And definitely a good way to at least solve this is to ensure that we are much more well educated on broader
Mm-hmm.
topics, and different topics as well, because we think about like specific cultures and there is always a picture or a word that will come to mind immediately. But we should definitely start encouraging, schools and media to stop censoring specific parts of that information and start bringing it out more and bringing out different parts of culture more to educate people.
Yeah, I think realistically, I think if we're taking Osaka as an example for our like delusional fanboy prejudiced person, um, I
Hmm.
think we should give him a little bit more credit than like the average like 2022 weeaboo, because he
Right.
doesn't have that same like internet access. Like the only way he finds out about Paris is like by news stories 15 times filtered through 17 different heads and like 27 different mouths. So it's a lot harder for him to find out the truth about Paris than it would be just like a quick Google search. So I think it's a lot easier for
Hmm.
them to get like totally absurd ideas about other countries than it would be like for us now.
Hmm.
Not to say he
Right.
isn't a
So
clown, you know?
right, not to say that he isn't a clown, but obviously he has had this already limited access, and the only way he can get to this is, through possible books through the restaurant itself, the Quion. I'm pretty sure you
Mm-hmm.
could pronounce it like that.
I don't know.
But yeah, he can only talk through people there, with other, Francophiles there. But yeah, so I suppose like, this understanding that technology is emerging now and new sources of information are coming out, that should not stop people from going to and learning more about cultures, because now we have more of an access, and so now we have less of an excuse.
Yeah,
So
I think that's
yeah.
everything, right?
Yeah, I
Well,
believe that's
yeah,
everything.
It's been very nice talking to you, my big Bobby blog friend. I hope you've enjoyed this collaboration podcast thing with me.
Of course, bi-weekly Bean. I am so glad that I got to partner with you and
Hmm.
boost my morale for today at
Yeah.
a high time of 12:56 a.m. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
I'll see you
Okay.
later eventually. Bye bye.
Yes. Goodbye, bi-weekly Bean.
Goodbye.